I focus in a lot on like the data, the data and infrastructure that we need to really understand where the value is and to measure it and to.
Maybe an overlap because I'm talking about developing. Oh, good. I will be.
It sounds like
turn to like the post-market setting.
Right. I'm going to talk about some of the different kinds of
What's our order? Jill, what's the order?
It's going to be Jeff first, then Greg, then you. That's why I put you in that order. I figured you could just pull it all together and say, we're not going to pay for anything you just talked about, so it really doesn't matter.
Well, no, I'm going to say we'll end up doing most of it because of professionalism and technology imperative, but that we can't afford it.
Welcome back, everybody, for our third and final panel as part of our conference on precision medicine. This is the panel on making precision medicine a reality, next steps for stakeholders. One brief note, we noticed that there's an additional break in the schedule after this panel, which we don't think we need because that is standing in between you and a glass of wine. So we want to eliminate that. I will make very, very brief closing remarks after this panel, and then we will, all of you are welcome to go downstairs for the reception. Okay, so thank you all for attending.
Good afternoon. I'm Mimi Riley. I am primarily from the law school, showing that the Center for Health Policy is truly ecumenical. They welcome me. And somewhat from the medical school as well, and actually somewhat from Batten. This panel is focused theoretically on solutions. You've probably figured out from the rest of the day that we're on our way perhaps to talking about solutions, but the way I like to think about it is contrast this panel with the last one. We're the optimists. So you got the pessimists, we're now, and that's pointed at you, Joe. And so what we're going to see here is some discussion of how some of these solutions can be generated, but we're also going to tag into one of the themes that has come out through the day, and that is value. And how do you recognize value? How do you support value? And so that, I think, will come out in our discussion. We're going to actually start with Jeff Chodakewitz. Did I get it right? Who has been teed up all through the conference. Mark McClellan did it in the first talk, but he is from Vertex, which is the company that has developed this novel and very important drug for cystic fibrosis. And so he's going to give us a concrete example of some of this in action. We're then going to move over to Greg, who continues this Duke theme. So your biographies are a little out of date, not quite, accurate as of today, and he'll actually be moving with Mark McClellan's group and heading up the Washington office of the new Duke Health Policy Center that will be collaborating a lot with us. And then we finally move to Chip Kahn, who has actually been the absent party all through our discussions. We've had a lot of discussions from drug companies, from policymakers, but we really haven't had discussions focusing on the providers. And he is currently heading up the Federation of American Hospitals. But he carries two hats today because in his past he also represented the American Health Insurance Organization. And as such, he's not only going to talk about providing, but paying. And all in an hour. So we're going to pull these solutions together, and Jeff, we'll start with you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I always thought that discovering and developing medicines was actually pretty hard, but after listening to the last panel or two and realizing some of the challenges we face, I guess I am feeling a little more optimistic. What I hope I can do today in the next few minutes is actually use ivacaftor as an example, because it really was, in my mind, perhaps a relatively simple example in the greater scheme of things, of following a precision medicine strategy. And it raises, I think, opportunities to show where we can accelerate and do things differently, but also still illustrate some of the challenges we still have just on the bringing medicines to patients kind of side, and then transitioning it on. Cystic fibrosis, I think, is a particularly good example because there is a lot that's understood about cystic fibrosis as a disease. We understand the genetics and why people get sick and some idea of how to assess whether they're getting better. And I'll provide just a little bit of feedback on that as we go to help put it in context. I know there's a lot of folks who are clinicians, people in different healthcare areas, but also some folks who are not. So I'll try to just fill in a few examples. It also has complexity because there's actually over 2,000 mutations that are associated with cystic fibrosis. And when you think about actually trying to come up with treatment, then you really have to think about it in a more nuanced way. And I think, I think our understanding has helped lead a path to that. When I think about personalized medicine, we heard all kinds of definitions as we went through the morning and last night. But one simple way to think about it from a drug development perspective is to try to match what we understand about the disease to the individual patient so that you can actually use medication that maximizes the benefit and or minimizes the risk. And my comments, as many are going to be about benefit, but I think it is important to realize that there are examples where our understanding of genomics has actually allowed us to minimize risk. There's a HIV drug that had a very bad hypersensitivity reaction that was defined for a limited number of patients. No one understood it until actually the genetics of that became clear, and then the drug was labeled so that people should be genotyped and people with a specific allele were excluded, and the risk of that hypersensitivity reaction dramatically went down. So there are multiple ways of thinking about using the information in the drug development process and in clinical decisions about doing drugs. The other thing I'll comment on is that this is really, I'm going to talk about the development process, but ivacaftor is an example where, because we understood the medication, the disease, we actually began the discovery program in a precision medicine strategy. People don't think perhaps as much about where do the compounds actually come from. But in fact, there was a huge amount of work that went over 10 to 15 years that really said, we know what we want to try to do, and we actually can predict that we're going to need different kinds of medicines for different patients within cystic fibrosis. And the discovery efforts that led to ivacaftor and others actually set up a system so that we could be looking proactively for the right kind of drugs, assuming that they were going to be targeted for subpopulations. And I think that really, again, it really then commits you to saying, if you discover it that way, you've got to develop drugs and use drugs in a way that makes sense based on the biology. Cystic fibrosis is maybe in 2 sentences, is really because patients have a defect in a channel. And that channel is present in many cells, in many organs. It's most evident in the lung. And that channel allows chloride to move out into the airspace and with it bring water. And in the absence of that channel, patients have essentially very viscous mucus, which serves as a nidus for inflammation and infection. And so patients have progressive lung disease, and that's often the source of death. In addition, they have abnormalities of their GI tract, of their liver, of their pancreas, many other manifestations. So you have to think about how do you assess clinical benefit in a broad way. In a subset of patients with cystic fibrosis, that channel actually gets out to the surface of the cell, but it doesn't work. Okay? And ivacaftor was identified as a drug that can reach that cell surface protein and force it open. And that then allows the chloride and water to flow. that is a small percentage of people with CF, as we'll talk about it, in total maybe 8%. There are different mutations where the protein doesn't ever get to the cell surface because of the nature of the defect. And you actually need very different kind of medications then to be able to treat those patients. So what we did then going into the clinic was to hone in very quickly on patients where we would predict who would think would have the greatest clinical benefit. And those are patients, we actually chose people with what's called a G551D mutation in the CF protein, and said that was 4% of people, and we actually did the entire initial clinical development program essentially in that 4% of a very rare disease. And what we saw was actually quite dramatic improvements, more than what was predicted, because we didn't know what these therapies were going to be able to do. And I think importantly, as we'll talk about, I'm sure, is that benefit was evaluated and seen in many different ways. There was an improvement in lung function. There was a decrease in the frequency of those lung infections that actually lead to the progressive loss of pulmonary capacity. There were improvements in body weight because the GI system began to work better. And that constellation of data was used as the basis for the initial approval of ivacaftor. The other thing I'll mention is that the safety profile actually was quite favorable, and we'll come back to that in a moment. We've also taken advantage of the fact that cystic fibrosis community actually has been very proactive in thinking about how do you track the disease? How do you learn from the disease? How do they as a community of patients and caregivers actually figure out how to approach therapy? And so there are actually registries of patients in the US and in Europe for cystic fibrosis. And so the data that we generated in our clinical trials has now been supplemented and perhaps overtaken by that observational real-world data that actually has confirmed the clinical value. But one of the things that Mark McClellan commented on last night, and that I suspect we may talk further about, is how do we think broadly about assessing clinical benefit? How do we understand if what we think is true really is true? And I think that this has been an example where we've been able to leverage what, in fact, the clinical community had put in place and define further what medications can do for patients. The next step in that process then, and I think this gets to where some of the challenges and opportunities can be, was to say that's that 4% of patients that we now have pretty traditional clinical data to support. Who else can benefit? And in this whole pattern, we've taken the assays that were actually being used to discover the medicines and did a feedback loop from the clinic to those scientists who were part of the discovery process, and began to feel that we could actually interpret the preclinical data and link it to clinical outcome. And so it really set up a learning cycle for how we thought about drug development and how we could apply things to patients. We then took that step, that first one mutation that had abnormal protein on the surface, and said, you know, there are some other mutations that are rarer, but actually look kind of the same from a molecular biology perspective. And we did another study, smaller actually, trying to group those 7 other types of mutations, and found that, again, there was clinical benefit. And so that data was submitted to the FDA and the label was expanded. We then took an even slightly different population that our preclinical data predicted would benefit, and did that clinical study. And in fact, again, those predictions held true and the safety profile was favorable. So based on even smaller sets of data, those patients were able to get access to the drug. And so I think that cycle of learning and actually predicting testing and changing the basis for how much clinical evidence you really need to make decisions is a very good paradigm for precision medicine in general. It links, actually, there was a question in the session this morning about translating expression of one mutant protein in one type of tumor to patients with a different type of tumor. There are always, of course, nuances, and you can't make conclusions from just one piece of data. But that as you begin to build an understanding, I think there is a huge opportunity that's got to be a shared responsibility of clinical community, industry, and regulators to actually say, how do you adjust what is needed? Where do you set an appropriate bar? And how do you actually get credit in a scientific sense for your increased understanding? To me, that is really an example of what personalized medicine should enable us to do. It's not a once and done, we're going to have a medicine, so we're going to know exactly what to do with 100% predictive power and be able to go in and get the answer and have everybody expect to say, okay, great. So maybe the last thing that I want to comment on is that there are still challenges that follow on. There are increasingly rare groups of patients where, in fact, you probably can never actually do a traditional clinical study. It's just not possible. But where the preclinical data actually predicts that the drug will provide very important clinical benefit for those patients. Right now, they have no path to actually getting to the medicine. And so, do we change the standard that we need? And do you actually go to those next patients and say, we're going to take very small anecdotal pieces of clinical data as confirmation? Do you actually get to the point where you actually have enough confidence in your preclinical data and the safety profile of the drug where you don't need clinical data, that the accrued clinical information is sufficient? And how do you deal with new technologies and new ways of evaluating patients? I was at the Cystic Fibrosis North American meeting a few weeks ago, and there are now groups in Belgium who are actually doing biopsies to get small amounts of tissue from patients with cystic fibrosis with very rare genotypes, taking that tissue, growing small, what they call organoids in culture, and actually adding drugs and saying, who's going to respond to what? It's actually a little bit analogous to people who, if you check to see if your infection is caused by bacteria that's susceptible to the antibiotic you want to choose. How do you start incorporating that kind of methodology into decisions about patient access and how we actually practice medicine in an era, of personalized medicine? I think it's going to be a fascinating topic. I think there's going to be all questions about combination therapy and what our standards are as we move forward. And that's all, I think, just in closing, I think this is not about lowering bars. This is not about not believing and having data that says drugs are safe or not safe for patients. It's really about aligning and using all the information at our disposal to actually make the best decisions for patients. So that's just, I think that to me that is a encouraging example. It's hard, it's not going to work for everybody or all these drugs, but I do think that there are paths that we're beginning to tread on that I think can give us more choices.
So I guess listening to this morning's session, or the session right before the lunch, and then just now, on the fly, I'm going to sort of change exactly how I plan to open up. And I was thinking about, a couple months ago, even maybe 3 or 4 months ago, when the term precision medicine was, really becoming popular. It was part of President Obama's initiative. It's in the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed by the House a couple months back in July and is going to be making its way through Congress on the Senate side. And this concept of precision medicine, a reporter called up Brookings and said, we want to talk to somebody about this precision medicine. What does it mean? And so that was me. So I talked to the reporter, and the first question was, well, this is just higher priced drugs, right? And the answer is, well, Probably, actually, but it's more than that. It will result likely in higher priced drugs, but it sort of means that we need to figure out how to deal with that and how to utilize these therapies. So that's sort of the opening that's generally what I'm getting at here, but I do have a sort of a logic to walking you all through. I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about the trends that we've been seeing in the pharmaceutical pipeline over the last couple of years, if not decade. And there's really not a great way to measure, true innovation. So if you could say, if you look at our pharmaceutical pipeline now, and then you look 5 years ago, and then 5 years prior to that, have we improved the level of innovation in our pharmaceutical pipeline? Generally, yes, but there's not a great way to measure that. So I've looked at some of the things that seem to be the things that people measure. So this idea of first in class. That's a crude way, if it's first in class, it's probably got a new mechanism of action. It probably means that it's more innovative than like a Me Too, so it's first in class. In 2014, 41% of the NMEs, the new molecular entities that were approved by FDA, 41% were first in class. About 5 years prior to that, it was like 20%, so it's gone from 20 to 40%. It's estimated that the drugs that are actually still in the pipeline now, so not approved but in development, 70% of those drugs are first in class. So we're really getting more innovative drugs. If we look at oncology, the concept of targeted therapy, so not the traditional chemotherapy, but drugs that are really designed to target specific genetic mutations, et cetera. About 11% of the cancer modalities were considered targeted therapy in 2003. In 2014, it was 50%. So oncology alone has seen this great increase in sort of this concept of targeted therapies. And this generally is sort of, and I'm sure, in terms of cystic fibrosis therapies as well, that these agents are extremely complex. They're very innovative. They're they're game-changing drugs for these patients, but they're coming at much higher prices. I think that we've seen a lot of in the lay media press as well as in the pharmaceutical press, a lot of focus recently on drug prices. Evaluate Pharma in September of 2014 did a report. They looked at the 100 top-selling drugs in 2010, and then they looked at the 100 top-selling drugs in 2014, so 4 years difference. And so for patients who were on at least one of those 100 top-selling drugs, on the median sort of total spend for a patient that was on at least one of those 100 top-selling drugs in 2010 was about $1,200, and in 2014 it was almost $10,000. The median patient population for anyone on one of those top 100 drugs went from 690,000 patients in 2010, the median size of the population that any of the drugs in the top 100 would treat, went from 690,000 down to 146,000. So we've gone from about $1,200 to $10,000, and then the population served from about 690,000 to $146,000. So that's targeted therapy. We're getting drugs that are much more expensive, and they're treating a much smaller proportion of the population. Those are some of the trends that we're seeing. This other term, specialty pharmacy, that generally is an umbrella term that applies to drugs that are generally either more complex to use, they're generally higher priced, and they take the payers generally put them into the specialty pharmacy bucket because it takes a bit more skill from the pharmacist or from sort of the program to really manage the use of these drugs. And so if we're looking at specialty pharmacy, IMS Health did a study just a couple of years ago that looking at the total drug spend in the United States and what proportion of that is specialty pharmacy. In 2013, it was 70%. 70% of the total drug spend, which was about $7.5 billion. That was in 2013. We didn't have Hep C treatments like we do now. In 2014, that's when Sovaldi came out. In late 2014, Harvoni. So this influx of hepatitis C treatments. And so in 2013, $7.5 billion total was spent on specialty pharmacy. In 2014, almost $6 billion was spent on Sovaldi alone. So the amount of spending that's going to specialty pharmacy is increasing. And hepatitis C drugs, they're coming at $60,000 to over $100,000 to treat a single patient in a year. We're also seeing new cholesterol modifying inhibitors, PCSK9 inhibitors, sort of revolutionary drugs to treat hypercholesterolemia. Praluent and Repatha were just recently approved as the first two PCSK9 inhibitors on the market, and they're both about $14,000 a year. And that population is pretty big, actually, so we're expecting to see the estimate is about 26 billion in sales by the year 2026. So these trends are, generally what we're seeing is more complex therapies, more specialty therapies, more targeted agents, and these are coming at much higher prices. The policies that we have in place right now, there's been a lot of emphasis in the 21st Century Cures, a lot of emphasis by Congress, not just this year, but back in 2012 when they passed the FDA Safety and Innovation Act. A lot of the emphasis was on improving the ability to get more innovative, more game-changing drugs on the market. So the breakthrough therapy designation was a concept that was established in law, in the legislation in 2012, which essentially, if you're a pharmaceutical company and you have a product early on in clinical development that shows very strong promise that this drug is addressing an unmet need and it's really, substantially better than anything else in its class, then you could apply for the breakthrough therapy designation. If you get it, that means that your company will work much closer with a team at FDA to really think how we might expedite the development and development of the evidence and the review of that particular product. And so there's much more sort of hands-on deck for breakthrough therapy designation because FDA and the company sees the potential value of this drug, so the emphasis is on getting that through clinical development much more efficiently. And then we see this sort of precision medicine initiative in 21st Century Cures and the President Obama's Precision Medicine Initiative. So the policies that we're seeing, precision medicine is not going to result in higher priced drugs, but it's part of a sort of a theme that we're seeing over the last several years of we need better, more sort of game-changing products that are on the market, and these products are very innovative, and oftentimes they're curing patients. They're certainly addressing unmet need. Cystic fibrosis is a tremendous example of where there have been great breakthrough products that are really addressing a need by patients, but they're coming at higher prices, and that's not a bad thing. If they're much better, they should be higher priced. But what it does mean is that we need to really figure out how to deal with that. And so there are proposals sort of how do we finance those. Hepatitis C is sort of a strange scenario where it's really expensive. You get a couple of doses and then that's it. It's not, hepatitis C therapies aren't used across a patient's lifetime. There's a couple of doses and then you're cured. And it's really expensive. But if you look at the amount of time that a particular health plan member stays within a given plan, whether Blue Cross Blue Shield, and then you sort of change jobs, and then you go to United, and then you change jobs again, you go to Humana. The average duration of a particular member in one of those private plans is about 2.5 years. And so if you're a health plan and you've got these hepatitis C patients, you're going to pay $100,000 for this particular treatment, the health plan is saying, okay, we'll do that, but where's our benefit back? Where are we going to save costs down the road? And the reality is mostly for hepatitis C patients is that you're not going to see those benefits until they avoid a liver transplant or something like that, which is generally like 20 years down the road. And so by that time, that patient's not going to be, if I'm not sitting at Blue Cross Blue Shield, they're probably not going to be in my health plan. They've changed jobs, or maybe they're already into Medicare. So some other organization is going to reap the benefits. So but yet I have to pay for that. So it just raises a lot of questions about how we finance products like that. Cures. If we came up with a cure for diabetes that we would give to somebody who's pre-diabetic, how would you price that? And what time frame would you reap the benefits? And so the financing of these things is raising a lot of questions, and we need to take a serious look if we're emphasizing the development of curative treatments where they are game-changing, but potentially the benefits aren't further down the road. They're extremely important. Patients should absolutely have access to these, so we need to figure out how to best finance them. The other part that I'd like to focus on is, okay, the knee-jerk reaction with hepatitis C and other therapies, even within cystic fibrosis, is, wow, these drugs are way too expensive, price caps. That's what we need. That'll solve everything. Let's just get price caps. But the reality is that's a bad idea because, the innovation is what we need to incentivize. It's very risky for a company to go into a niche market, a small market, and really put the energy and investment into developing game-changing therapies, which often come with brand new mechanisms of action where we may not really understand the biology or the science of that particular disease. So there's a lot of investment that goes. It's very risky to put that investment up front, and then to the percentage of actually, the percent success of getting a drug all the way to market is just extremely low. So it's very risky, but we need the incentives in there for investors and for companies to invest in areas of unmet need. So price caps are not going to be the answer because you're not going to get the investment in those areas. What I'd like to spend the rest of the time on is focusing on, so let's talk about value. Maybe the question isn't what we see, the sort of knee-jerk reaction of, if we're paying this much, is it worth it? But maybe the question should be, how can we make sure that we're actually getting value from these therapies? So that comes from understanding the patient population who should be getting these therapies, understanding the best way to use these therapies within the population, and then actually being able to measure, when we see value, will we be able, when there's value, will we see it? Will we see which patient population we're actually seeing the value in? And so to do that, it takes much more emphasis on collecting post-market data. And we heard early how, the post-market data really helps us understand the real-world environment, what's really happening with these patient populations. And so, we can, so I've got sort of three major areas where I think future policy directions should go into. One is just this concept of continuous learning. How can we, the worst way to do it is how we've always done it, which is we spend a lot of time in clinical development, the FDA approves the drug, and then we say, okay, we hope for the best. Off with you, drug, and go, do what you do, and we hope it all turns out well. That's not continuous learning. What we really need is a system that continues to collect evidence on the use of those products in the patient population. And we've started to do that a little bit. We've got, FDA has the Sentinel system, which is made up of all of the major health insurance companies that capture all these claims data, and we can link drug exposure to outcomes, and FDA uses it for safety surveillance. So if there's new products on the market, they can, within a couple of days, actually identify if there's any safety signals by using a distributed data infrastructure where all of the major health insurance companies are participating in this concept of safety surveillance. PCORI is spending a tremendous amount of money in building out the PCORnet system, which is clinical data, hospital systems with patient registries, and sort of linking those to claims data to build a platform to develop better evidence. And that can really help providers and payers to better understand when these drugs do come on the market, can help identify the best, most valuable uses of those drugs, and which patient populations are the drugs really benefiting in terms of where are we having adherence problems, where can we direct resources to improve adherence and things like that. So continuous learning is sort of an incremental step, but it's something that we don't do routinely now, and we need to be doing. So how do you incentivize that? So the next step up in my mind is sort of, there's this concept of tying reimbursement to data collection. So, CMS has had the coverage with evidence development concept. It hasn't gone over very well. It's not routinely used, and I'll tell you why. But the concept is, if you're a payer and you're not really sure if you should be covering something, Medicare populations, you have a new device or some new procedure, and Medicare is saying, well, that was studied in a much younger population. We don't really know if it's good for the senior population, so we're going to sit on the fence for a couple of years, see what happens, and then we'll make a coverage decision. Well, the coverage with evidence development program is a tool that CMS has that they could say, okay, instead of just sitting on the fence and waiting for some other studies to happen, we can actually start covering the product now, but require that the treating physician or require that the data from that particular use of the product actually goes into a registry. So you cover it right away, but you only reimburse if the provider participates in this registry. So you're guaranteeing you get data collection, and so it enables earlier access in the Medicare population while you're actually generating evidence. It's a concept that doesn't work really well because right now it's really costly to even do something like that, and so the Medicare program doesn't pay for the data collection itself. Somebody else has to do that, and that's been sort of a non-go issue for Medicare because we don't have a routine reusable data infrastructure in the United States that you could quickly, if the data is already being collected, you can quickly sort of say, okay, let's do a coverage with evidence development policy since we already have this national network of continuing collection of data. That's what we need, where you sort of continue to use claims data linked with clinical data that's reusable. So if we had something like that, we could do something like CED more often. For precision medicine, this can actually be really important because there are two aspects that in precision medicine. We have the targeted therapy itself, and then we have the diagnostic. And there's been a challenge to get the diagnostic tests covered by payers, and the challenge is that there's not a lot of clinical evidence to support the utility excuse me, of some of these diagnostics. So specialty pharmacy, precision medicine, these diagnostics, it's an example where something like tying reimbursement to actual collection of data could be useful. And then sort of the last thing is actual, fundamental payment reform with drugs and devices. We hear, and I think, Mark talked about yesterday maybe, I don't know what he talked about, but I suspect he said something about getting away from fee-for-service and, paying physicians for delivering better care, higher quality care. So that's what people are focused on, but nobody's really focused on how to do that with drugs and devices. So the payment for drugs continues to be a fee-for-service, and there's a lot of reasons why. It's really hard to implement paying for value, but the concept really, we do need to look at how our benefit structures are designed, how we can implement actual pay-for-value type scenarios where, if the drug is actually resulting in high-value care, that the reimbursement for that particular product is sort of reflects the value that we're seeing in the population. If it's not, then the reimbursement should reflect that we're not seeing value from that particular product. It's not a hard concept to understand. It's a hard concept to implement for sure. But that's certainly where we need to go, particularly because of precision medicine, where we're going to, these trends in the pharmaceutical development are going to continue to be more specialty drugs at higher prices, and we're going to need to figure out how to get to more of a value type payment. Otherwise, we're going to get price caps, and that's something that we do not want. And so we need to figure this out and do it right. The last part of this, I know I said last a couple times, but I wanted, somebody brought up on the earlier panel value, but value to whom? That's an important question because what patients see as value might be different than what the health plans see, which might be different from what the providers see. And so that's okay. We all have a different definition of value, but we need to understand what what value means to patients, providers, and payers. And be able to measure it. That'll be a critical component of all this.
Well, no, I'm not going to solve anything at all, probably. But I'm going to take a little bit different approach, and I also want to respond to Greg a little bit. First, let me start off by saying, having been involved since the days I worked on Capitol Hill in payment reform, particularly in the context of Medicare, let me say unequivocally, fee-for-service is never going to go away, never has gone away, even in the places where people think it has. And with all due respect to the earlier panel, MACRA is nothing more, that's the bill that reforms the physician payment Medicare, nothing more than taking fee-for-service and putting some metrics on top of it so that there's some metrics that might affect a payment to a doctor a few percentage points, or mounting some kind of alternative delivery payment models, which we don't have yet, as Joe pointed out, but which will be based on fee-for-service. Even the bundling demonstrations within Medicare are totally dependent on fee-for-service. The only real aspect of Medicare that isn't completely dependent on fee-for-service is the DRG system, which was dependent on the cost system that was invented back in the 60s. So I've been around long enough, and all this stuff about changing payment, we do need to change payment, but basically we have two forms of payment. We have fee-for-service, we have capitation. And at the end of the day, whether it's fee-for-service or capitation, and this is my point, we're talking about a very expensive enterprise, and the determination of value, which will be useful, is then going to be based on a set of assumptions, which is going to be very hard for society to make. You can decide whether something has no value, does nothing for patients, but there's a long way from that to has some value, has a lot of value, and that's where it becomes very difficult. So I'll start with that. And I'll also say that I had trouble in thinking about how to approach my remarks today because I had trouble getting my hands around precision medicine. And I say that because I now have a sense of what the definition is listening to the early speakers, but I'll sort of make an analog to make the argument that it's nice to have this category, but at the end of the day, in terms of general medical practice, I'm going to argue that it doesn't mean very much. Now, why do I say that? Well, I have trouble getting my hands around this thing called population health. And I was talking to an economist the other day who gave me an example of population. I said, give me an example of population health. He said, well, I'll give you one. He said, I was doing some work for a very large clinical practice. And at this group practice, they had a number of just high-level, great specialists, and a lot of the Medicare beneficiaries went to the specialists and didn't necessarily go to a primary care doctor at the practice, or maybe didn't go to a primary care doctor at all. So when the EHRs came along and the electronic health records and they started to apply big data analysis to their data, they found out to their shock that compared to other groupings of seniors, they had a really bad stroke rate. And they couldn't understand why. And they started to look at it and they said, well, wait a second. We've got all these people going to the specialists, and they're not taking a blood pressure. So they came up with the notion of, well, let's require all of our physicians on every visit, and obviously the nurse could do it, to give a blood pressure to the patient, even if they were going to the ophthalmologist or they were going to the dermatologist. So they started doing blood pressures. They found patients who had dangerous blood pressures. They identified those patients. They counseled those patients. And if they didn't have a primary care doctor outside the practice, they set up an appointment for them, got them to the primary care doctor, and began to give them medication for high blood pressure. And lo and behold, after a certain amount of time, they lowered the stroke rate for their population of patients, whether they went to the specialist or the primary care doctors. And that was population medicine, right? Well, isn't that just appropriate care medicine, just a little smarter? And so my point is that it's all the same thing, and that at the end of the day, what we're talking about is what ought to be a standard of care, what is determined by the powers that be medically necessary. And so I don't really separate these practices. All the practices they're describing now, 5 years from now, assuming that they make it through all the regulatory hurdles and other hurdles, will be accepted as standard of care, because once it's done over a number of years, no cystic fibrosis patient that has a certain genetic profile is not going to be treated that way, right? That's going to be accepted practice. If it's not today, it'll be a few years from now, and at that point, we are going to have to deal with the expense, but I'll get to that in a moment. So my point is that the game-changing technologies, whether it's robotic surgery or what we're now calling precision medicine, is all going to have to be accommodated in our system because it's unstoppable. We cannot resist it. I didn't say we could afford it, but I just said we cannot resist it. And also, I think what even we define as precision medicine, I would argue, will become a lot more things than medicine per se. You know, I know of a little company right now, a startup, that has taken certain Medicare data on skilled nursing facility patients, and they can tell you, you know, in Manhattan for a given hospital, within the catchment area around that hospital, profiling X number of patients, they can tell you which nursing homes get the best results for a particular profile of patient, whether it's a stroke patient or an orthopedic patient. They can tell you where they get the best rehab and the best outcomes. There's a really good data set in this particular case in Medicare. We don't always have such good data sets. And in a sense, I would argue that kind of profiling is a type of precision medicine. I mean, it's saying that a patient that's sitting in a hospital about to be discharged, the discharge planner is inventing a profile for the patient, which is a relatively unique profile, and they can compare it using the big data to another profile and say, if you go there, you will get your risk or your possibility of benefit is much greater than someplace else. So I think we need to think about this precision medicine in a larger context because, and in a sense, that's probably a saver as a therapy because if the person goes to the right place, they're less likely to have readmission, so they'll save us money. One more point before I get into my imperatives, and that is this ledger problem that Greg brings up. It is a big problem when we think about savings from any kind of prevention or other kind of therapy in healthcare, because the fact is we pay for healthcare from all these different ledgers, whether it's the federal treasury, whether it's Celgene's employer pool, whether it's through the exchange, the Blue Cross patients in Virginia. And I don't think we're ever going to get to a point, because of the way people bounce around, and even in Medicare, you know, 30% of the beneficiaries are in Medicare Advantage, you know, there's not that much change from year to year, but there's some change there. So for all of our populations, I think it's going to be very difficult to ever find the savings for any expensive therapy within the coverage they have at a given time. And I think we have to just accept, and that's the point of pooling, that it'll all come out in the averages. Now, it may not for every plan. Obviously, for co-ops and other kinds of insurance inventions, they can't make it in this kind of environment. But hopefully for bigger plans, and we're heading to a place where we're only going to have 5 or 6 insurance companies anyway, and the federal government, so maybe it doesn't matter. That's a joke, but
But it's so true.
but it's so true. So now, what I would like to do next is look at this, these game changers in the context of sort of 5 imperatives in healthcare and provide a framework for us to think about how to assess them, and maybe it might be useful for the discussion that will follow in a few minutes. So what are my 5 imperatives? First, and I think foremost, and I think frequently discounted by economists, consumers, and purchasers and payers in the healthcare system, is that, and above all, whether it's clinicians or it's those who are operating hospitals or those who work in hospitals or in most areas in healthcare, there is a very high level of professionalism. Nurses don't get up in the morning, drive to work, and want to harm patients. That is just not, now I can't say that in the deepest bowels, and I need to be careful in terms of political correctness here, the deepest bowels of Florida, there aren't some durable medical equipment salesmen or home health providers who are of questionable ethics and morality. But them aside, I think everyone in this field, everyone else in this field, wants to do the right thing. They want their setting to be safe, and they want what they do that day to be effective. Now I'm going to get into economics because obviously there's some arguments that can be made about incentives. But I think the primary incentive is professionalism, and I think that most clinicians and most of the places they practice and provide services are into adapting and adopting. So going back to my initial point, I think that the treatments and maybe the diagnostics get into a little complexity because of payment. will be done and will be integrated, first point. Second point, we continue to have, and I think we have, but both because of social attitudes and professionalism, and I'm going to get to economics, a technological imperative that's unstoppable. And actually, you know, what Greg described in his assessment, I mean, go back to 1978, 79, you know, we had technology assessment then, and it was no different. And frequently, to me, all the studying's great, but, you know, when you take TPA versus streptokinase, what you frequently find, and if you remember, that was one of the major studies back in, I guess, the late 80s, of comparative effectiveness, what did you discover? It's complicated. Under certain circumstances, it's one drug. Under other circumstances, other drug. So with all the analysis that ought to be done, it will be very difficult in many cases to transfer that analysis to an effective value-based assessment of whether one remedy should be paid for or another not. I mean, not that it can't be done, but I would say it's not going to be the norm. Not to say we shouldn't do the analysis, but I think it's very troublesome for policymakers and payers particularly to just make the assumption that we can make broad societal decisions about technology that I think are going to be a lot more complex than they assume. And also, I think we do in this technology imperative sometimes jump into rabbit holes we can't get out of. I have no idea, and I'm going to be, and if I insult anyone here, I got to be careful. You know, I have no idea whether robotic surgery is really right, but we have no choice. You know, that firm with the Italian name and every hospital in the country and the perception of what is better has led us down a path with robotic surgery that I've got a friend in Israel who wanted to do a study of how effective robotic surgery was against the old-fashioned using the hands, and what he discovered was that the diffusion is so great that it really wasn't worth doing the study. And frankly, I can't say whether that is a better technology, but we're stuck with it. Hopefully with some of the precision medicine, we will do some of the value judgment and make some decisions before we go in head first, but my experience has been we always seem to go in head first. Now, my third imperative is the financial or economic imperative. And that one is very mixed, because on the one hand, despite what some think, there is no free lunch. Everything we're talking about has to be paid for. Now, what you pay for it is a different point, but somebody has to pay for it. And going back to my ledger's point, that's where it makes it very difficult to figure out how to deal with it. Presumably, as long as we have Republicans in any office of significance in the country, we're not going to have across-the-board price controls. You know, Maryland is a unique place that will not be replicated in terms of its hospital rate regulation, and I'm not really sure what they do anyway in terms of the kind of price controls that Greg raised concerns about. But at the end of the day, from a societal standpoint and from a fiscal standpoint, we do have a problem, and it was much discussed this morning about, you know, in the state policy. You can look at isolation. In the state, you really can say education versus health. At the federal level, it becomes a lot more complicated. I'm not sure it's one versus the other. And then in terms of our society, because we have so much private payment, it becomes more difficult. But in a sense, we have always had some kind of rationing, and that is going to, I would argue, even with all these, with the imperative of ACA to ultimately have everyone covered, what we're seeing is a trend which is, I think, unstoppable of an increase, a significant increase in cost sharing. And whether it's the premium side or whether it's the cost sharing side, I mean, even your silver plans that are maybe heavily subsidized, at the end of the day, those people will have either high deductibles or very narrow networks. And if they go out of network, they're going to be charged prices. So I think there are tremendous stresses, and I almost feel like I'm being a little glib to say this is all going to become the standard of care. It will all be done, because at the end of the day, there's a rub. 2 more points. We have a reform imperative which has taken hold, both on the coverage side with ACA, and we could talk about that later, but I think more importantly in some ways, and I was disappointed a little bit, in some ways I think in the comments this morning, for better or worse, Medicare is a change agent and has been used as a change agent, and we do have on the pay-for-performance side as well as on the managed care side, tremendous experiments going on, a number of experiments going on with Medicare, and I think they will make a difference, albeit they're still going to be in the context of fee-for-service, but we could talk about that. And I think that moving towards better management of either episodes or better management of the continuum of care is a useful goal that maybe Medicare is pushing us towards. Maybe not, but at least they're trying. And then finally we have, and this ties back to reform and to the economics, an accountability imperative, which is relatively new in my career since the late 70s in Washington, because I think it was tried or thought about, but it really is, it is real today. And we are moving to a system where metrics and evidence-based care actually means something. Now, how well it can be tied to payment and the notion of value, I'm troubled by, but we at least now have in Medicare hospital services, in the private sector, in hospital service, crude metrics, sometimes crude process metrics and outcome metrics, and we're not really at yet patient-reported outcomes. But I think over the next decade, we will find ourselves, hopefully if we can work through too much measurement, we will find ourselves with a lot of measurement that will allow for the big data kind of assessment of what we're doing in treatment and diagnosis that Greg described, where we can begin to make solid decisions about what not to do. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to value judge what to do, because I think we'll still do everything that the data doesn't show we shouldn't be doing. I'll end with that.
So I feel like I was attacked. Do I get 30 seconds to rebut? No, I'm just joking. 30 seconds? So to just... No, I wasn't. So to just react to the, I guess what was a little bit of a de-emphasis on the evidence development in your example is that, payers are, are no longer asking yes or no. Is this drug better? Should we cover this drug? It's more in what and this is the problem that they have, because the medical policy committees routinely come out with, but the clinical trials aren't really asking the questions that we have. We want to know, in what patient population does this drug make sense? And so that's payers. And then on the provider side, I think, a recent paper came out with the majority of clinical practice guidelines aren't evidence-based at all. They're not based on evidence. And, one thing that's different between now and the 70s that you pointed out is that we collect electronic clinical data much more routinely than we did back then. We don't do anything well with it right now, but we collect, electronic medical record data, claims data, many more patient registries. So the data are there. I'm suggesting that more emphasis on harnessing that data to actually do the kinds of analysis, because we can do many different kinds of analyses now with that kind of with that level of data. That we can begin to start asking questions like, in what patient population does this drug have higher value, and can help guide not just payers making coverage decisions, but can also guide the clinical practice guideline development and providers. One interesting part of the 21st Century Cures Act, which sort of opens the door for FDA to begin using real-world evidence in its decision-making, is that it's emphasizing the potential for these kinds of routinely collected data in the post-market setting to actually measure useful information on not just drug safety, but also drug effectiveness, and interestingly, population, sort of not just does the drug work, yes or no, but in what actual patient population is it showing better. And if you have sort of big data where you're collecting data, you can't do this in any one health plan or in any one patient registry, but if you actually begin to collect data on millions of patients, you can start to subset the data and look actually at different population characteristics and better understand what's actually improving. It's hard to do. We don't do a lot of great things with the data now, but we can.
Well, actually, I'll just take a second. I mean, when I said what not to do, I guess I'm agreeing with you there.
Oh, okay.
I agree with you completely. I guess what I'm saying when I'm making at least making the argument that we're going to keep doing it, and I guess that's where I take the hepatitis drug. And I think not that we shouldn't try to figure out a value for the hepatitis drug. I don't think we're ever going to come up with a value for the hepatitis drug. And I think at some time, maybe payers can bludgeon an insurance company to bring down a price in the old-fashioned negotiation, but I think it's going to be very difficult to come up with any policy where we're going to really be able to value that in a way that we can, justify. I don't think it's going to happen. So actually, I'm in agreement with you very much about the data.
Oh, my goodness. Go ahead.
This is a question for Jeff, although it's a little bit related to the last discussion. So you made the point, and Mark McClellan also did last night, that clinical trials might not be that useful for some of these new specialty drugs. And I think the argument is it's a small population, so it's hard to do. I'm hoping you could expand on that a little bit more. And I have two thoughts that you could react to. One is these drugs are supposed to be more effective, so you should have more power with even a small trial. So that, in some sense, it's hard to find the population, but if it really works, it should be actually easier to see an effect. And I guess the second would be, well, in the absence of these, then what? Because we have lots of cases where things look good, so we put them into the clinical trial. So based on sort of the preliminary data you're talking about, things look good, but in fact they don't work, and we're talking about very expensive drugs here.
No, great. So I think you raise a number of interesting challenges, important challenges. Maybe just to say up front, your point is absolutely right about saying that if you get bigger effects, it's easier to actually show to show benefit. But when you start talking about smaller and smaller populations, there are populations, just we can use CF as an example, but there are plenty to use, where there are 10 patients in the world with that mutation. So I mean, truly physically not being able to do studies the way we think about it, and certainly our traditional definition of randomized controlled trials, I think you can get some information, but even with somewhat bigger populations, you're not going to get all the answers that you want, all the answers that we were just talking about, saying, how do you actually make relative judgments? I do think then that, so I don't think I meant to say, if I did, I'll step back from it, that the clinical trials aren't valuable, but it's that, are they going to be able to give us all the answers? Sometimes even in the bigger populations, where I think it's that longitudinal data, it's saying not just did pulmonary function stay stable for 3 months, but if you follow those people for 3 years or 4 years, which what it really takes, are you actually having a disease modification effect? I think those are going to require different kinds of studies. Patients won't stay on placebo arms, nor should they, for 3 or 4 years. And I think you have to think differently about using long-term observational data. Maybe sometimes you put in some extra pieces to improve the fidelity of the readout, but fundamentally you actually still use other pieces of data. And I do want to comment also on your very good point about false positives and how do you actually distinguish? Because there are going to be some false positives. Things sometimes do look better initially and then it doesn't play out. To me, I think there's a couple of things that modulate that. I think it's about using all the pieces of data, because yes, any given data point can lead you astray, but as you put it all together, I think you do reduce that risk, not to zero, but you reduce it. I think then there's also an issue of benefit risk. Sometimes some of the therapies that we come up with are not very well tolerated. I mean, that's traditional in cancer therapy, although that's getting better, but there are risks to everything. But I do think you have to say, what is the uncertainty? What is the disease that you're treating, and what's going to happen to that person if they don't get treated? And then you have to do the calculus on an individual example, because I think you're right. There is a potential for drawing a false conclusion that over time you can help correct, but you have to decide how where you draw the balance.
Just to add to that, the challenge of the clinical trials often is, the patient's not studied. And so particularly in precision medicine, where we're getting more and more, the use of companion diagnostics and genetic markers that can actually help enrich clinical trials. So we're seeing more adaptive clinical trials where we sort of do some screening up front, and the patients who show some either sensitivity to the particular product or have a genetic mutation, then they get sort of channeled into a different arm, and that enables a much more efficient, shorter, smaller, and potentially cheaper, depending on how much it costs to screen, clinical trial. And that's generally for a more narrow indication too. So then you've got these products that might get approval based on those kinds of clinical trials. And adaptive clinical trials are more often in phase 2 studies, although FDA is looking at how to do phase 3 clinical trials using Bayesian methodology. You will end up with a product approval for a very narrow indication, and the reality of that is off-label use. We have it a lot now, and we're going to have it even more before, because if you have this new game-changing therapy, but the indication is small, there are many patient populations that the physicians and folks will want, and patients will want to try that. And so therein lies a prime example of the value of sort of observational study once a product is on the market, because that product might show benefits in a non-indicated population, and that can help. And the fact that 21st Century Cures sort of opens the door for FDA to consider utilizing these kinds of observational data in regulatory decisions, not NME approvals, but maybe new indications, label expansions, that these observational data and registry data, observational data, including registries, can support. It's a big step forward, I think.
Maybe just to add one thing, I do think there's also a question about early on doing clinical trials to actually show the negative, that because I think that does address some of the concern that you're raising, is that if you say it's going to work here and we show it, but actually we would predict it's not going to work here, and actually I think that can be incumbent in real world data, but I think that can be incumbent on a sponsor, the people developing the drug, actually to understand that early on.
And are you going to have people publish the negative? That's the crucial piece, right?
Well,
because without the publication of the negative, it doesn't.
So first of all, actually, I know there's a lot of sensitivity around that. First of all, with CT.gov and things like that, that's really, everything's out there, as it should be. But absolutely, I mean, ivacaftor is labeled not just for who it works in, but for who it doesn't work in. And we supported that.
Carolyn.
So, Daniel Callahan once said that in the U.S., invention is the mother of necessity. And Chip and I are old enough to remember what happened to OTA, the Office of Technology Assessment. So my question is, we've talked all day about how expensive new treatments are, how much we're spending in our healthcare system, how we don't want price controls, how it doesn't sort of suit our national DNA. So my question is this, probably to Greg and Chip, but Jeff weigh in as well, and Mimi too, if you want. Do you believe in our lifetime we will ever see PCORI or the FDA use cost effectiveness in their analysis, and or will we ever see Medicare negotiate prices with the pharmaceutical industry?
Let's just let Chip answer that alone.
I think lifetime is a long time, even for those of us that are further along. So I have trouble with that concept and getting my hands around it. But even within 10 years, I think it is unlikely, unless we have some major fiscal crisis and there's real surgery done to entitlement programs, that we would get to the negotiation. But and in terms of cost effectiveness, yeah, I mean, I think the kind of analysis that's being discussed here is going to be done. You know, I remember, I think Gail Walensky years ago wrote a New England Journal article when she was HICFA administrator on cost effectiveness and really got shelled for it. And I think that analysis, you know, I think we're going to, with the better data, we're going to be able to have more revealing findings. But I don't think that I still don't see the agencies, because cost effectiveness immediately, you know, cost effectiveness, it's not the analysis, it's the assumptions. And those assumptions are public policy in themselves. And I have trouble visualizing the public policy that you could draw, i.e., or e.g., death panels. I mean, you know, and you could say, well, the Obama administration is going ahead with death panels, I mean, in a way. But I think it's politically troublesome. You could run into political quagmire very quickly as soon as you lift the hood on what those assumptions are about the cost side of that cost effectiveness thing.
Yeah, so I think, well, PCORI sunsets soon anyway. But I think it's nonsensical for them not to look at cost effectiveness, to be honest with you. They need to be looking at cost effectiveness, and groups should do that. But I don't think we want FDA to look at that. You know, FDA, they're a utility to make sure that when there's a new product on the market, that the benefits outweigh the risks. And that's all I want. That's what I want them looking at. I don't want FDA to also consider costs, because, you know, if I want to spend more for a particular drug, I should be able to do that. I don't need FDA to keep it off the market just because the cost number wasn't there, even though it could be a potentially curative drug, or it could really help me with my own condition. I don't need the FDA to keep it off the market. I would like another group to sort of do the, you know, and payers, that makes sense and everything. But even if a payer doesn't cover it, that doesn't mean you can't, you know, there are channels to get therapies that are on the market, even if your insurance, it's hard to do, but, you know, there are different channels to do that. But I do not think that FDA, the ones who are responsible for, you know, do the benefits outweigh the risk, and therefore it's legal to actually market the drug in the United States, I don't want them to look at costs, because that should be left up to the payers or the patients or whoever, but not restrict it from the market because of costs. But PCORI and other groups, they should certainly look at that.
Benefit risk and cost benefit are not the same thing.
In the back of the room, I should remember your name, but I don't.
My name is Michael Swanberg. I'm from the School of Nursing. And actually, at the first session I asked the question, I was reflecting on my visit to the National Institute of Health last week, where 3 times as many patients have sickle cell disease as cystic fibrosis, but cystic fibrosis is funded 4 times more than sickle cell disease. So, and the answer seemed to be kind of Darwinian, that the person who yells the loudest gets the most funding. So my question, and when I looked around in that first session, every person in the session kind of looked like me. They had white skin, they had white hair. So my question now is, in terms of stakeholders, how do I get more ethnic minority people around the table when the decisions are made? What will be targeted when we're looking at precision medicine?
Yeah, so I have a couple of comments. I don't think I have the actual answer to your question, but it's an interesting disease area. I mean, it was one of the the 20 disease areas that the Congress required FDA to hold is sort of as part of their patient-focused drug development program, sort of areas where there's not a lot of development, bring the patients in, help us understand what really matters to you, help us, from the FDA's perspective, and sickle cell disease was one of those. From a science perspective, it's really, I don't even think they understand the biologic, the sort of scientific underpinnings of the disease itself to understand where the cure would be. I mean, a lot of the therapies there are a couple in the pipeline now, but they're largely targeting sort of alleviation of symptoms, of pain and other sorts of things. But, as if I reflect on sort of the areas, it's the strong patient advocacy groups that I think it does go along with sort of what you were saying around the loudest, the loudest voice gets the funding, and patient advocacy groups have been instrumental in making supporting advances in therapy. I think cystic fibrosis is probably the preeminent example of where the patient advocacy group partnered with the manufacturer to actually really work on that issue. And the AIDS community back in the 80s, they were instrumental in sort of the patient advocates there were instrumental in getting what we now call, accelerated approval, which is approving a drug off of a surrogate endpoint, which never was going to be the case, and it really speeds up drug development. The advocacy community was instrumental there. So it's the power of the advocacy community, I think, that's there. And so the question that I think you're asking is, how do you get
the right model where the person with the loudest voice?
I think that's the model that we have, yeah. And so what needs to happen, I would support the notion that a strong patient advocacy group would be needed to sort of, go into DC and get, call for more funding in that area.
I think Greg said something that was very important, and that is, and I think it's true with almost, show me a disease advocacy group, and I'll show you a drug company. There's alignment. AIDS was sort of an exception because it was a distinct group of people with a very high-profile disease that was very focused and was, politically in the spotlight. But other than that, you look at the disease groups, and there's always a pharma behind them someplace. And I don't know much about the relationship between sickle cell and the industry, but if without mentioning names, but if Merck or Pfizer or one of those guys tomorrow decided to make sickle cell a priority, then you would see and they've been putting money into it, you would see an incredibly powerful voice, because there are people out there that could form a stakeholder group that could be loud about it. But, it takes sort of grease and energy and stuff to get those going. And the other side is that, on a mostly low-income group, maybe it's harder, but still, you could do it, but you got to have, I think they're always there. I mean, and also, with cystic fibrosis, you're also, like you say, it affects white middle-class people. And
Right, the last speaker made the comment, how much is your life worth? But I think, yes, how much do we value certain people's lives in this society?
Well, let me put it this way. If there was a feeling by some drug company that they could get a drug or set of drugs developed and paid for that related directly to even this population, I can promise you they'd be on it. Now, you could also draw some other parallels, which is this of the uninsured populations, even with ACA, this is a highly uninsured population. So, as drug companies are doing their profiling of various diseases and populations, they're doing a calculation. Well, whatever I produce, if I ultimately get to the goal line, are they going to be able to pay for it? And that's another part of the calculation.
One thing that I want to jump back really quickly on a point that I missed on the patient advocacy community. We did we sort of at Brookings, we've had a number of expert workshops on antibacterial drug development and sort of there's a lot of economic challenges for investors to go into this space. But one of the other things that sort of came out of all of our discussions on what's missing in this community is that in multi-drug resistance itself is not, there's no patient advocacy group for that. When you have an infection, you sort of identify, if it's a multi-drug resistant organism, you might identify as a patient with a chronic disease that you might have, or you might not consider yourself a patient. So there's no really sort of patient advocate community around multi-drug resistance itself, and that's led to sort of previously a lack of policies around incentivizing drug development and that. Although IDSA has had, Infectious Disease Society of America has had some success in getting policies in there, but from a patient advocacy community, they're missing that, and it goes back to a strong, well-organized patient advocacy community is an important aspect.
Maybe just one other comment I'll make, that timing matters, and that taken, I think, really good comments. There is some now methodological advances being made in gene editing and things like that are actually now raising the question about is there a new path for diseases like sickle cell? And so I think actually there are, that voice, it also has to happen at a time when there actually is a potential path. And I think maybe, hopefully, we're at a point where there's going to be some new opportunities to match up with that voice.
So one moment I want to, and I'll come back. The last piece I'd like to add to this is the group that we really haven't had out here, which is all of us. There's a cultural piece to this as well. It's not October anymore, but you couldn't go to a football game last month without it being awash in pink. And yet, breast cancer is not the biggest killer of American women. It's heart disease. Yes, you're wearing your heart disease right there. So I think this is a bigger problem that we haven't pulled out, because as the government funding is decreasing, we're seeing more and more advocacy funding becoming important, especially in the academy, and we're going to have to think about how to address that going forward. I'm going to let one more question, then I have a global question that I'm going to sort of tie to the university for all of you.
Wasn't pharmaceutical, or rather NIH distribution of money, which is taxpayers, and they should identify a minority group, which is the second minority in the US, by the way, it's not small, and distribute the money. To answer the question about when the path exists, there is a paper just published by the Korean group, which was able to reverse sickle cell anemia. I know it's in mouse, but it was the first paper that ever proved sickle cells can be cured. So the path is there right now. So we need NIH African American director to change this. We need, because the African American president didn't change this. So what is that we need to change the system that is so wrong? What do you think?
I agree with the sort of comment. It's the model that we have, probably not the best model. I don't know what the best model is. The other thing that I don't know is sort of what funding within the NIH structure itself, what the budget is in terms of the therapeutic areas. So it sounds like you do, but increased funding from NIH, maybe that would help. I just don't know what I wouldn't be able to say that because I don't know what the actual funding is right now to that disease area, if there is any.
So to sort of finish us out, as a broad theme we've had throughout the last 2 days is the idea that the edges between clinical care and research are blurring. And as we are training physicians for the future, or indeed those of us who work at the periphery of this, and moving towards an idea that in many ways all care is research, And in fact, in your world, cystic fibrosis, it's pretty close to that. And in adaptive clinical trials in cancer, we're seeing that as well. But as we think about training people who will be working in this future world, what should we be focusing on as we're trying to get them prepared?
So I'll jump in just because something popped in my head. Really what you were describing is this learning healthcare system. And that, IOM has talked about that quite a bit, and but maybe not as big of a buzzword right now as precision medicine, but the learning healthcare system is something where the concept is more than just collecting data, but it's actually utilizing that sort of train of continuous evidence development, but informing care decisions at the point of care. And I would say that the collection of data and developing the evidence is not the hard part. It's actually having that sort of routine feedback loop so that the practicing clinician and the patient can, in real time, take that evidence and have it support decision making. So, I think the answer is there in the clinical, not just in medical school, but in pharmacy school and nursing school, et cetera. It's training the practitioner to understand evidence, to be able to translate research findings into care decisions. It's that pull through is what's really hard, and including that as a component in clinical programs is, I think, a critically important part.
I think that in our system, it's really difficult to achieve what we need to achieve, which I agree with Craig, because on the one hand, and particularly as capacity to use data develops, we're going to know a lot more. On the other hand, I think we historically had, although it was based on something, but we had medicine as habit in terms of practice, rather than really being evidence-based. And so that led to dilemmas like, not just too many cesarean sections, but once you do a cesarean, you always have to do another cesarean. And things that became habit or accepted practice that really were not evidence-based. And the trouble is, to break that, then we get a little bit into economics, because whether it's back surgery or other treatments that various specialists may adopt, it becomes really troublesome, because it's not just habit, it's economics. And we're going to have so much evidence in short times, and so much analysis with the data that's going to be available, that somehow I think one of the things that physicians need to learn how to do, which doesn't work too well with specialties necessarily, is they're going to have to learn how to reinvent themselves. And they're going to have an attitude about reinvention, which is not a simple thing when you borrowed X amount of dollars to go to med school and you don't start practicing till you're 33. But I think that somehow that's got to be ingrained in them, and that's not going to be easy, but I think it's really necessary, because there's all the developments we talk about, and all the possibilities of those developments. The diabetes was mentioned earlier today. It wouldn't just be that if you could find that magic bullet for diabetes, it also would affect a lot of those physicians who are making all those decisions about the diabetic. And as the great leap forward with hepatitis shows, there's possibilities on a lot of things. And so I think doctors have to think about how to reinvent themselves in their training, and I'm not sure how you teach people how to do that.
So it's a great question. It's interesting. There are probably people in the room who know. I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if physicians graduating now are making different assumptions, or aren't already making the assumption that what they've learned today is going to change by the time it's 10 years from now or 15 years from now. It's about having a system that actually, in an integrated way, supports being able to make those changes. The other thing is that the complexity of the data that's being generated is so great. I don't know if it's reasonable to think that every person whether a clinician, nurse practitioner, whoever it is going to be able to make all the assessments. But to me, what I would love to see emphasized more is being a customer of data and actually that critical thinking, because I think that is a habit that I think has to be established really early, and then is applicable. You could change your specialty, you could change the diseases that patients are coming in to see you about, but if you can have that clarity of not just reading a conclusion in an article, but saying, do I believe that? Does that make sense? How is that going to affect my action? I think that's a lifelong skill. That's the lifelong learning mindset that I think, it's not unique to medicine, but of course the stakes are, I think, uniquely high.
Sounds like a good place to end.
Well, thank you to the last panel. Real quick, before we break to the reception, I want to thank everyone who made this conference possible.